Hello there, it's Terry here from Cloudy Coral Designs. I'm so excited to be here today. In today's video, I will be sharing ways to use water reactive ink on white cardstock. There are several different water reactive inks, but today I will be using Distress Oxides. Distress Oxide is made out of dye and pigmented ink. One of the cool properties about this ink is that it reacts with water. Aside from the reactive properties, there are many things that you can do with these type of inks. And today I will be sharing a few ways to use it in your projects. So let's get started. Okay, so water reactive ink pads can go directly onto the stamps. I don't have any specific reasons to where I'm placing the colors. I just want to make sure that I have enough coverage of each color on the stamp. The colors that I am using on this card is Ripe Persimmons and Wilted Violet. Before pressing the stamp onto my cardstock, I went ahead and spritzed a little bit of clean water from my Distress sprayer onto the stamp. Since this is a water reactive ink, the water will help move the ink around and help with the blending process. I used a paper napkin to help dab up the water on the cardstock to prevent the ink from browning. And then I repeated the process until I was happy with the outcome. On the second card, I did the exact same thing, but I added more colors. One of the great properties of Distress Oxide is that you're able to layer the colors on top of one another very easily. Keep in mind that when the ink on the cardstock is still wet, the additional layers of the ink will blend. If you want to add layers of ink without blending, you will have to make sure that the cardstock is dry before additional stamping or layer is done. Water reactive ink is a great ink to use for blending. Since it's a fusion ink of dye and pigment, the ink properties are able to sit on top of each other. This makes ink blending so effortless. Keep in mind that using the right paper for blending is important too. It is recommended to use smooth cardstock such as the one I'm using here, Strathmore Bristol Smooth. When ink blending, make sure that you're using a very juicy ink pad. The more ink that you have on your blending tool, the better. I like to use circular motions while blending between the layers and reapplying additional ink on top if needed to help smooth out the blending. The colors that I use here are Ripe Persimmons, Fossilized Amber, and Wilted Violet. And this is how it looks after all the blending has been done. Okay, so remember how I said that this is water reactive? I used my Distress sprayer to spritz some water onto my hand and splatter it all over my card front. The water will oxidize and create a beautiful effect on the ink cardstock. You can let it air dry, but I like to use a napkin or a towel to dab off the water. And if you wanted to add more interest to the card, you can use stamps and water to create a lifting effect. Here, I am using a stamp and spritzing it with only water. I use that to press onto my card front. This creates a lifting effect from the reaction with water. Isn't it cool? Another cool way to add interest to your blending is using a technique called Embossed Resist. Embossed Resist is created from embossing a stamp image in clear embossing powder before inking. This creates an awesome effect when ink blending because the embossed areas will resist the ink. I like using a nice sticky ink, and my go-to ink is Versamark ink. And here I'm applying clear embossing powder to the ink. After using my heat gun to melt the embossing powder, I then went ahead and ink blend. Once I am satisfied with the results, I use a microfiber cloth to wipe off the ink that's sitting on top of the embossed areas. Remember, the embossed area is resisting the ink, so wiping it off will give a clean white image. Okay, so another way to use reactive ink on white cardstock is using a stencil. Here I am using this awesome stencil with rainbows of Distress Oxide inks. Using my blending tool, I went ahead and added ink on top of the stencils in rainbow order. I'm not being too careful with separating the colors here because I do like the look of the two colors mixing. But if you prefer not to mix the colors, you can definitely leave that out. Remember when I mentioned that the ink is perfect for layering on top of one another? Here I am using this cool bat stencil on top of the background that I created using the direct to stamp process. Since this background is now completely dry, the ink that I apply on top will layer instead of blend. Using a blending brush, I am adding on Twisted Citron and Black Suit. I really love how this turned out. Okay, so another way to use reactive ink on white cardstock is using the ink in the form of watercoloring. On this example, I'm using Kitsch Flamingo, Savage Patina, and Squeeze Lemonade. I applied the inks directly onto my craft surface, and using my distress sprayer, I spritzed some water onto each color. This will help dilute the ink to create a liquid consistency, similar to watercolor paint. Using a small round brush, I applied the mixed formula to my cardstock, as if I was painting using regular watercolors. There's no specific reasons to placement here, I just wanted a good mixture of colors. So, to top this off, you can add water splatters, but what I like to do is use the leftover ink on my craft surface and splatter that onto my cardstock. So what I do is I load up my paintbrush with the ink and use one finger to tap the paintbrush to create the splattering effect. See how magical this looks? Oftentimes, I will forget that reactive inks can stamp out sentiments beautifully. To give it a bit more shine and interest, I like to stamp the sentiment, then clear emboss over it. It creates a really nice look. Okay, here's another way to use reactive inks on white cardstock. I like to use it on my embossing folders. So on the side that's not raised, I like to apply Distress Oxide with my blending brush. Using my blending brush here will soften up the blending. I am using the color Squeeze Lemonade and Salty Ocean. If you're looking for a brighter background, I would recommend going directly onto the embossing folder with the ink pad. Simply blend in the middle of the two colors to soften up any harsh lines, and the final results is completely different from the first. Here, you can see the two side by side. Okay, so this example is called ink smooshing. There's two ways to ink smoosh. The first way is to apply the ink directly onto your craft surface and use your cardstock to smoosh on top of it. And the second way is to use acetate to help control the placement of your ink. The two ways will give you different results, so depending on the look that you're going for will ultimately decide which method to use. When ink smooshing, you want to remember to dry your cardstock in between smooshing to avoid a muddy blend. When the cardstock is dry, the ink will layer on top of the previous ink instead of blend into it. Here you can see me using acetate for the ink smooshing. Like what I did previously, I applied ink onto my craft surface and spritzed water on top. This time, instead of using my cardstock, I will use the acetate to grab ink and place it onto my cardstock. Using pouncing, swiping, or any technique you like, you'll get a different result each time. I really like this method because I'm able to control where I place each color. And here you can see how the look is quite different from the first. There are many ways to use reactive ink on white cardstocks. What I shared today are just a few examples. I do hope that you discovered something new, and please come visit my Instagram account at Cloudy Coral Designs. Until next time, have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.